The acrid stench of burnt metal and scorched earth hung heavy in the pre-dawn air, a sickening symphony of destruction that pierced the quiet calm outside Houston, Texas, in 1996. Emergency lights, flashing a frantic ballet of red and blue, cast long, dancing shadows across the smoldering remains of what was once a vehicle. But this was no ordinary car fire, no routine accident on a deserted road. This was the scene of a discovery so profoundly disturbing, so utterly inexplicable, that it would echo through 2 decades, a chilling testament to a mystery that refused to be forgotten. Inside the charred shell of that pickup truck, fused with the wreckage, lay the body of James Dalton. A firefighter. A man dedicated to battling blazes, now consumed by one in the most horrifying way imaginable. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a dark question mark etched into the heart of a tight-knit community, a cold case that would defy logic and demand justice for an agonizingly long time. James Dalton was more than an emblem of a uniform. He was a pillar of his community, a man whose life revolved around service and family. At 42 years old, he was a seasoned firefighter, respected by his colleagues at the local station for his calm demeanor under pressure and his unwavering commitment to saving lives. His days were a rhythmic blend of early morning shifts, the clang of firehouse bells, and the quiet comfort of returning home to his loving wife, Susan, and their 2 teenage children. They lived in a modest, well-kept home just outside the bustling city, a sanctuary where laughter often mingled with the scent of his wife's home cooking. James was known for his steady hand, his booming laugh, and a quiet strength that made him a natural leader, both at work and within his small circle of friends. He coached his son's Little League team, volunteered at church events, and was always the first to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. His routine was predictable, his character impeccable, painting the picture of a man utterly without enemies, a man whose life seemed to flow with an almost idyllic peacefulness. That peace shattered into a million burning fragments on that fateful morning. The initial call came in as a vehicle fire, a common enough occurrence. But as the responding units approached, the intensity of the flames, the isolation of the location, and the gruesome realization of what lay within the inferno, instantly elevated the situation from accident to atrocity. James Dalton, the very man who bravely faced down such horrors, was now its victim. The discovery sent shockwaves not only through his station, where hardened firefighters wept openly, but across the entire Houston metropolitan area. Questions immediately eclipsed any semblance of understanding. How could this happen? Why James? The initial reports from the scene were grim, hinting at something far more sinister than a simple mishap. The position of the truck, the ferocity of the blaze, the complete destruction of identification inside, each detail screamed of an unnatural end. Investigators immediately recognized that the answers would not be found in the ashes alone. They lay hidden in the motives, the secrets, and the shadowed corners of human intention. Before we delve deeper into the labyrinthine twists and turns of this gripping cold case, a chilling narrative spanning decades and defying easy answers, please remember to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single part of this extraordinary story as we unravel the truth behind James Dalton's tragic end. Stay tuned as we meticulously piece together the fragments of evidence, confront the lingering questions, and ultimately seek the justice that was denied for far too long. The immediate aftermath of the horrific discovery plunged investigators into a whirlwind of activity, yet also into a perplexing fog. Crime scene technicians meticulously scoured the charred landscape, their trained eyes searching for any anomaly amidst the devastation. Every fragment, every discolored patch of earth, every twisted piece of metal was catalogued, photographed, and carefully collected. The scene processing was arduous, hampered by the sheer intensity of the fire, which had consumed much of the evidence that might typically lead to a quick resolution. Forensic specialists worked tirelessly, sifting through the debris with an almost surgical precision, hoping to reconstruct the events that led to James's untimely demise. The initial findings were chilling. While the truck was undoubtedly the locus of the inferno, the cause of the fire itself remained stubbornly elusive. Was it a malfunction? An accident deliberately staged? Or something far more sinister? The autopsy findings only deepened the enigma. While James Dalton was found within the burned vehicle, the medical examiner's report indicated that he had not died solely from the fire. Evidence suggested possible incapacitation before the flames took hold, raising immediate red flags. This wasn't merely a tragic accident or a spontaneous combustion. It was quickly becoming apparent that James had been targeted. The ambiguity surrounding the precise cause of death, coupled with the suspicious nature of the fire, forced law enforcement to acknowledge they were dealing with a probable homicide. Theories swirled through the investigation room, perhaps a disgruntled individual from his past, a random act of violence, or a deeply personal vendetta. Every lead, no matter how tenuous, was pursued with urgency. In the initial weeks, several individuals found themselves under the microscope of law enforcement. Colleagues from the fire department, though largely grief-stricken, were interviewed extensively. Friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances were questioned, their alibis scrutinized. Were there any known conflicts, any simmering resentments, any financial disputes? Detectives probed into James's personal life, searching for cracks in the facade of his seemingly perfect existence. An ex-girlfriend from years past, a minor disagreement with a local contractor, even a contentious interaction at a recent Little League game, all were briefly considered persons of interest before being cleared. The sheer volume of interviews yielded little concrete evidence, leaving investigators frustrated and the case shrouded in a growing sense of mystery. Each potential suspect, after thorough vetting, yielded no direct link to the crime. The Houston community reacted with a potent mixture of profound grief and unsettling fear. News reports saturated local channels, painting a vivid, albeit tragic, picture of James Dalton's life and his shocking death. Flags flew at half-mast at the fire station, draped in black. Tributes poured in from colleagues who remembered his dedication, his bravery, and his unwavering camaraderie. For a community accustomed to seeing its firefighters as heroes, invincible protectors, the idea that one of their own could be so brutally taken, and under such mysterious circumstances, was deeply unsettling. Local sentiment oscillated between outrage and helplessness. There were candlelight vigils, memorial services, and a pervasive sense of injustice that rippled through every gathering. The fire department, a tight-knit family, was particularly devastated, not just by the loss of a dear friend, but by the nagging question of who could commit such a heinous act against a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. Despite the exhaustive initial efforts, the case of James Dalton slowly began to succumb to the weight of unanswered questions and elusive evidence. Forensic teams had done their best, but the fire had destroyed too much. Witness statements were often vague, contradictory, or led to dead ends. Without a clear motive, a definitive cause of death that tied directly to a perpetrator, or a smoking gun piece of evidence, the momentum of the investigation inevitably waned. The task force assigned to the case dwindled, their resources reallocated to other active investigations. Slowly, agonizingly, the file on James Dalton's murder shifted from the active case pile to the cold case shelf. The initial fervor faded, replaced by the quiet hum of unresolved tragedy. Despite the promise of justice, the lack of conclusive evidence meant that, for the time being, the flames that consumed James Dalton's truck also consumed the hope of a swift resolution, leaving his family and community in a painful limbo. The quiet hum of unresolved tragedy deepened into a silence that stretched across years, then decades. The promising leads had vanished like smoke, the initial investigators had retired or moved on, and the collective memory of the devastating event, once so vivid, began to blur for all but those closest to James Dalton. The case, once a searing priority, gathered dust in police archives, a thick file tucked away, its pages holding the fading hopes of justice. Time, often a healer, became an insidious enemy for the Dalton family, lengthening the shadow of grief and transforming their acute sorrow into a chronic, aching void. Each passing year without answers amplified their pain, making the injustice feel more profound, more entrenched. The world moved on, but for Susan and her children, life remained irrevocably marked by that horrific morning in 1996. Holidays were tinged with sadness. milestones celebrated with a palpable absence, and every news report of another cold case solved brought a fresh wave of both hope and despair. They yearned for closure, for accountability, for someone to finally explain why their beloved James was taken from them in such a brutal manner. Susan Dalton, a woman of quiet strength, refused to let James's memory, or his case, simply fade away. She became an unintentional advocate, a relentless voice echoing in the halls of justice that often seemed deaf to her pleas. She wrote letters, made phone calls, attended support groups for families of cold case victims, sharing her story repeatedly, hoping that one person, one detective, one journalist, might finally listen and reignite the dormant investigation. Her children, now adults, carried the weight of their father's unsolved murder into their own lives. They grew up without his guidance, without his booming laugh, and with the constant, gnawing question of who had done this to him. They joined their mother in her tireless quest, using new avenues like online forums and social media to share James's story, hoping a stray memory, a forgotten detail, or a guilty conscience might finally pierce the veil of silence. The emotional toll was immense, a perpetual wound that never truly healed, only scabbed over temporarily before being picked open again by a memory, an anniversary, or a renewed flicker of hope. Living without answers, without a clear narrative of what transpired, left them in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to fully mourn or move forward. Yet, even as years piled upon years, the world of forensic science was undergoing a quiet revolution. Technologies that were mere nascent concepts in 1996 had matured into powerful investigative tools. DNA analysis, for instance, had evolved from rudimentary techniques requiring substantial samples into highly sensitive methods capable of extracting profiles from microscopic traces. Advanced chemical analysis could now meticulously deconstruct fire accelerants, pinpointing their exact composition and origin with unprecedented accuracy. Digital forensics, non-existent in its current form in the mid-90s, offered new ways to examine old data or even recover information once thought lost. These advancements represented a glimmer of hope, a scientific lifeline that promised a fresh perspective on evidence collected decades ago, evidence that might have been deemed inconclusive or insignificant by the limitations of past technology. The very fragments that had once confounded investigators now held the potential to unlock secrets. It was against this backdrop of evolving science and enduring family persistence that James Dalton's file eventually found its way onto a different desk. A newly formed cold case unit within the Houston Police Department, or perhaps a dedicated detective with a penchant for unsolved mysteries, initiated a routine review of dormant investigations. The sheer brutality of James's death, coupled with the lack of any clear resolution, made his case stand out. The detective assigned to the file, perhaps a younger investigator who hadn't been on the force in 1996, approached it with fresh eyes, unburdened by the previous dead ends and frustrations. They saw not a hopeless enigma, but a challenge, an opportunity to apply modern investigative techniques to a historical tragedy. This renewed interest wasn't necessarily spurred by a new lead or a dramatic confession, but rather by the quiet, methodical process of re-evaluating old evidence through the lens of sophisticated new tools. The collective efforts of the Dalton family, coupled with scientific advancements, had finally shifted the tide, pulling James Dalton's case out of the shadows and back into the light of active scrutiny. The long wait for justice, though agonizing, now held a faint, yet undeniable, promise. The quiet hum of unresolved tragedy deepened into a silence that stretched across years, then decades. The promising leads had vanished like smoke, the initial investigators had retired or moved on, and the collective memory of the devastating event, once so vivid, began to blur for all but those closest to James Dalton. The case, once a searing priority, gathered dust in police archives, a thick file tucked away, its pages holding the fading hopes of justice. Time, often a healer, became an insidious enemy for the Dalton family, lengthening the shadow of grief and transforming their acute sorrow into a chronic, aching void. Each passing year without answers amplified their pain, making the injustice feel more profound, more entrenched. The world moved on, but for Susan and her children, life remained irrevocably marked by that horrific morning in 1996. Holidays were tinged with sadness, milestones celebrated with a palpable absence, and every news report of another cold case solved brought a fresh wave of both hope and despair. They yearned for closure, for accountability, for someone to finally explain why their beloved James was taken from them in such a brutal manner. Susan Dalton, a woman of quiet strength, refused to let James's memory, or his case, simply fade away. She became an unintentional advocate, a relentless voice echoing in the halls of justice that often seemed deaf to her pleas. She wrote letters, made phone calls, attended support groups for families of cold case victims, sharing her story repeatedly, hoping that one person, one detective, one journalist, might finally listen and reignite the dormant investigation. Her children, now adults, carried the weight of their father's unsolved murder into their own lives. They grew up without his guidance, without his booming laugh, and with the constant, gnawing question of who had done this to him. They joined their mother in her tireless quest, using new avenues like online forums and social media to share James's story, hoping a stray memory, a forgotten detail, or a guilty conscience might finally pierce the veil of silence. The emotional toll was immense, a perpetual wound that never truly healed, only scabbed over temporarily before being picked open again by a memory, an anniversary, or a renewed flicker of hope. Living without answers, without a clear narrative of what transpired, left them in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to fully mourn or move forward. Yet, even as years piled upon years, the world of forensic science was undergoing a quiet revolution. Technologies that were mere nascent concepts in 1996 had matured into powerful investigative tools. DNA analysis, for instance, had evolved from rudimentary techniques requiring substantial samples into highly sensitive methods capable of extracting profiles from microscopic traces. Advanced chemical analysis could now meticulously deconstruct fire accelerants, pinpointing their exact composition and origin with unprecedented accuracy. Digital forensics, non-existent in its current form in the mid-90s, offered new ways to examine old data or even recover information once thought lost. These advancements represented a glimmer of hope, a scientific lifeline that promised a fresh perspective on evidence collected decades ago, evidence that might have been deemed inconclusive or insignificant by the limitations of past technology. The very fragments that had once confounded investigators now held the potential to unlock secrets. It was against this backdrop of evolving science and enduring family persistence that James Dalton's file eventually found its way onto a different desk. A newly formed cold case unit within the Houston Police Department, or perhaps a dedicated detective with a penchant for unsolved mysteries, initiated a routine review of dormant investigations. The sheer brutality of James's death, coupled with the lack of any clear resolution, made his case stand out. The detective assigned to the file, perhaps a younger investigator who hadn't been on the force in 1996, approached it with fresh eyes, unburdened by the previous dead ends and frustrations. They saw not a hopeless enigma, but a challenge, an opportunity to apply modern investigative techniques to a historical tragedy. This renewed interest wasn't necessarily spurred by a new lead or a dramatic confession, but rather by the quiet, methodical process of re-evaluating old evidence through the lens of sophisticated new tools. The collective efforts of the Dalton family, coupled with scientific advancements, had finally shifted the tide, pulling James Dalton's case out of the shadows and back into the light of active scrutiny. The long wait for justice, though agonizing, now held a faint, yet undeniable, promise. The re-examination began with an almost archaeological precision. Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the resurrected case, spent weeks immersed in the dusty, brittle files from 1996. He painstakingly reviewed every police report, every interview transcript, every lab finding. He gazed at crime scene photos, now digitized, but still retaining their stark, horrifying clarity, as if the incident had just occurred. He studied the topography of the burn patterns, the twisted metal, the shadows cast by the emergency lights, searching for anything that might have been overlooked in the initial chaotic hours. Old witness statements were reread, not just for what they said, but for what they didn't say, for subtle inconsistencies in tone or detail that might have been dismissed as insignificant back then. The sheer volume of material was daunting, a tangible weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions, but Miller approached it with a meticulous patience born of experience. He knew that cold cases were often cracked not by grand revelations, but by the accumulation of tiny, almost imperceptible details. It was in this exhaustive review process that a subtle, yet crucial, detail began to emerge. Tucked away in an obscure corner of an old supplemental report, detailing the findings from the fire accelerant analysis, was a brief mention of an unusual trace element. In 1996, the technology to definitively identify this element and its specific source was rudimentary, and its presence had been largely dismissed as environmental contamination. However, Detective Miller, with the benefit of modern forensic knowledge, recognized its significance. This particular trace element, almost like a chemical fingerprint, was characteristic of a very specific, commercially produced solvent, one not commonly used as a fire accelerant. It wasn't the gasoline or lighter fluid that investigators often encountered. This was something different, something specialized. It was a detail so small, so easily missed, yet its implications were enormous. It hinted at a perpetrator who had access to, and knowledge of, particular industrial-grade materials. This overlooked detail provided the first tangible new lead in decades. The seemingly insignificant trace element, when cross-referenced with modern chemical databases and industrial applications, pointed towards a specific type of manufacturing facility in a neighboring county, a place James Dalton had no known connection to. However, further digging into the original interview logs from 1996, specifically those pertaining to James's professional network, revealed a fleeting mention of a former colleague from an earlier, less prominent fire department. This colleague, a man named Robert Jenkins, had a brief, well-documented stint working at that very manufacturing plant before joining a different fire station. The connection was tenuous, circumstantial, but undeniably present. It was the first thread in a very old tapestry that Miller could truly tug on. With a new person of interest identified, the investigation shifted from archival review to active fieldwork. Detective Miller initiated discreet background checks on Robert Jenkins. He discovered Jenkins had a somewhat checkered career after leaving the fire service, including minor legal troubles and a reputation for holding grudges. Surveillance was established, subtle at first, designed not to alert Jenkins but to observe his daily routines, his associates, and his current lifestyle. Every piece of public information, every social media post, every financial record that could be legally accessed, was meticulously gathered. The goal was to build a comprehensive profile, to understand Jenkins's life trajectory since 1996 and, most importantly, to discern if his path had ever again crossed with James Dalton's in a way that could explain the brutal events of that fateful night. The silence around James Dalton's murder had finally been broken, not by a shout, but by a whisper from the past, carried forward by the winds of forensic science and tireless dedication. The detailed inquiry into Robert Jenkins began to unveil a more complex and troubling individual than initially suggested by a mere checkered career. Detective Miller, along with his team, delved deep into Jenkins's past, unearthing a pattern of resentment and volatile behavior. While Jenkins and James Dalton had initially been cordial colleagues during their brief overlap at an older, smaller fire department, their relationship had soured significantly. Records indicated a bitter dispute over a promotion that James had received, which Jenkins felt was unfairly denied to him. This wasn't just professional jealousy. It was an ingrained sense of injustice that festered within Jenkins for years. After leaving the fire service, Jenkins's life had indeed gone downhill, marked by a string of failed jobs, including the manufacturing plant where the unique solvent was used, and a growing financial burden. He had married and divorced twice, leaving a trail of acrimonious separations, and his current financial situation was precarious, marked by mounting debts. The motive, once a complete mystery, slowly began to crystallize, a poisonous cocktail of professional envy, personal failure, and a deep-seated grievance against James Dalton, who seemingly had everything Jenkins felt he deserved. Building a modern case on evidence and memories stretching back decades presented formidable challenges. Detectives faced the daunting task of re-interviewing individuals who might barely recall specific details from 1996, or who had since passed away. Memories fade, perceptions shift, and the passage of time can distort even the most vivid recollections. Witnesses from Jenkins's past, particularly those involved in his financial troubles or failed relationships, were approached delicately. Some were reluctant to speak, preferring to let sleeping dogs lie, while others harbored old resentments that made their testimony potentially biased. Legal hurdles were also significant. Any new evidence had to meet rigorous modern standards for admissibility, and the chain of custody for older physical evidence had to be meticulously re-established to prevent contamination claims. Miller's team meticulously cross-referenced every new piece of information with the original 1996 files, searching for corroboration, however subtle, that could bridge the 20-year gap. The fragmented nature of the memories often felt like trying to piece together a shattered vase after most of the fragments had been swept away by the winds of time. This was precisely where the application of new forensic techniques became indispensable, transforming the investigation from a cold case review into an active, cutting-edge pursuit. The trace element previously identified was sent for advanced chemical analysis, specifically a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which could provide a definitive molecular fingerprint. The results were startlingly precise. The accelerant used was an industrial-grade solvent, an exact match for the specialized product manufactured at the plant where Jenkins had briefly worked. Furthermore, thanks to the meticulous, though limited, preservation efforts from 1996, a few fibers recovered from the truck's interior, too small and degraded for analysis back then, were now subjected to mitochondrial DNA testing. This less common form of DNA analysis, which traces maternal lineage, offered a chance to link the fibers not to a specific individual but to a family line. While not a direct match to Jenkins's nuclear DNA, the mitochondrial profile provided a compelling connection to his family. These scientific breakthroughs provided the objective, indisputable evidence needed to overcome the vagaries of human memory and the challenges of time. Armed with this potent combination of circumstantial motive, modern forensic science, and a comprehensive understanding of Robert Jenkins's life, the detective team began to strategize for the inevitable interrogation. This wouldn't be a simple questioning. It would be a psychologically intense confrontation, designed to break through decades of silence and denial. They spent days meticulously planning every aspect: the interview room setup, the sequence of presenting evidence, and anticipating Jenkins's potential responses. Legal experts were consulted to ensure every step adhered to contemporary legal standards, given the age of the case. They knew Jenkins would deny involvement, likely attempting to poke holes in the old, fragmented evidence. The strategy was to dismantle his defenses piece by piece, starting with subtle inconsistencies, then moving to the irrefutable scientific evidence, culminating in the inescapable truth of his long-hidden actions. The team rehearsed various scenarios, determined not to let this chance for justice slip away. The chess game was about to begin, with 2 decades of a killer's freedom at stake. The interrogation room was stark, deliberately devoid of distractions, a stage set for psychological warfare. Detective Miller sat opposite Robert Jenkins, the table between them a silent barrier, yet also the focal point of the immense emotional pressure that would soon fill the air. Jenkins, initially composed, even a little smug, entered with a practiced nonchalance that belied the gravity of the situation. He was a man who had lived with a dark secret for 20 years, and that secret had become a part of his very fiber, a protective shell. Miller began calmly, almost conversationally, reviewing Jenkins's background, his time in the fire service, his brief employment at the manufacturing plant. He spoke of James Dalton, carefully observing Jenkins. Jenkins maintained a facade of polite disinterest, offering non-committal answers, his eyes occasionally flickering with a subtle defiance. The detective listened patiently, letting Jenkins believe he was in control, slowly drawing out his narrative. As the hours wore on, the casual tone began to shift. Miller started introducing inconsistencies, small details from past interviews or public records that didn't quite align with Jenkins's current statements. Jenkins's composure began to fray at the edges. His answers became slightly more defensive, his denials more emphatic, betraying a growing unease. He shifted in his seat, his gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape, a weakness in Miller's steady demeanor. The detective then subtly introduced the topic of the promotion dispute, watching as a raw, almost primal anger flickered in Jenkins's eyes. It was a brief, telling moment that confirmed Miller's suspicions. The old wound still festered, a deep-seated resentment that defined Jenkins's perception of James Dalton. The psychological cat-and-mouse game intensified, each question a calculated move, each answer a potential trap. Then came the scientific evidence, presented with a quiet, undeniable authority. Miller placed enlarged photographs of the gas chromatography mass spectrometry results on the table, highlighting the unique trace element found in the accelerant used to ignite James Dalton's truck. He then showed Jenkins a diagram of the manufacturing plant where he had worked, pointing out the specific area where that very solvent was produced and stored. Jenkins's face paled. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a visible tremor. He stammered, attempting to explain away his presence at the plant, but his words lacked conviction. The scientific precision of the evidence was a brutal, objective truth that his practiced denials could not withstand. The room grew heavy with the weight of his unraveling fiction. The final blow came with the mitochondrial DNA evidence, linking him not directly, but unmistakably, to the scene through his family lineage. When confronted with the microscopic fibers, pulled from the charred remains of James Dalton's truck and now connected to his own genetic line, Jenkins finally cracked. The dam of his carefully constructed lies burst. The years of carrying the secret, the decades of denial, crashed down upon him. His eyes, now filled with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate relief, met Miller's. He slumped forward, his shoulders shaking. The confession, when it finally came, was a torrent of words, a release of pent-up guilt, and a desperate attempt to justify his actions. The truth behind James's death was a sordid tale born of bitter envy and a twisted sense of victimhood. Jenkins confessed that he had ambushed James that night, incapacitating him with a blow to the head before dousing the truck and James's body with the specialized solvent he had pilfered from the manufacturing plant. He chose the solvent precisely because he knew it was unusual, hoping to complicate any investigation, believing it would be untraceable. He had meticulously planned the ambush, fueled by years of resentment over James's perceived success and his own spiraling failures. He saw James as the embodiment of everything he was not, everything he wanted but could never achieve. That fateful promotion had been the catalyst, igniting a slow burn of hatred that culminated in the brutal murder. The motive wasn't random, it wasn't a stranger's act, it was a deeply personal, meticulously planned execution, driven by an insidious jealousy that had festered for 2 decades. The silence was finally broken, and the ugly truth of James Dalton's murder emerged from the shadows. The silence was finally broken, and the ugly truth of James Dalton's murder emerged from the shadows. The arrest of Robert Jenkins ripped through the community like a sudden, violent storm, leaving a trail of disbelief and shock in its wake. News of his apprehension flashed across television screens and newspaper headlines, a name once whispered in forgotten corners, now shouted from every conceivable platform. For 2 decades, who killed James Dalton? Had been a haunting, unspoken question, a phantom limb of grief for many. Now, the answer had a face, a name, and a history, and it was a name many in the Houston area recognized. Jenkins, a former colleague, a seemingly ordinary man who had blended back into society, was now revealed as a cold-blooded killer. The revelation sent shockwaves not just through the fire department, where some remembered Jenkins, but among countless individuals who knew both men, marveling at the insidious capacity for evil hidden behind an unassuming facade. Neighbors spoke of Jenkins as quiet, perhaps a bit gruff, but certainly not a murderer. The stark contrast between the public persona and the horrific crime was jarring, almost unbearable to process. People struggled to reconcile the image of the man they thought they knew with the monster who had committed such a heinous act. The community, already scarred by the initial tragedy, was now forced to confront the betrayal, the realization that a killer had walked among them, undetected, for so long. With Jenkins's arrest, the wheels of justice, which had ground to a halt so many years ago, began to turn with renewed urgency. Formal charges of capital murder were swiftly filed, and the arraignment was a somber, highly publicized affair. Jenkins, appearing disheveled and defiant, pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for what promised to be a lengthy and emotionally charged trial. The preliminary hearings began immediately, with legal teams on both sides meticulously preparing their cases. The prosecution, armed with Jenkins's confession and the overwhelming forensic evidence, felt confident in their ability to secure a conviction, but the defense was determined to discredit the decades-old evidence and paint their client as an innocent man, caught in a web of circumstantial accusations. Every court filing, every motion, became front-page news, reigniting public interest in a case that had long been relegated to the archives. The legal proceedings were complex, navigating the nuances of evidence collected under different forensic standards and dealing with the challenges of presenting decades-old testimony. For the Dalton family, Jenkins's arrest brought a torrent of conflicting emotions. There was an undeniable, profound sense of relief, a weight lifted that they hadn't realized was crushing them for so long. The incessant question of who finally had an answer. Yet, this relief was inextricably intertwined with renewed pain. The floodgates of grief reopened, transforming the dull ache of absence into a sharp, piercing sorrow. Susan Dalton, now a matriarch whose resilience had been tested beyond measure, shed tears that were a mix of bittersweet joy and agonizing remembrance. Her children, who had grown up haunted by their father's violent death, now faced the man responsible for stealing their childhoods. They spoke to the media, their voices trembling with a mix of anger and gratitude, expressing their hope that this was truly the beginning of their long-awaited journey towards justice. The process of confronting the perpetrator, dissecting the details of James's final moments in the courtroom, promised to be excruciating, but it was a path they were prepared to walk, armed with the knowledge that James's killer would finally be held accountable. The prospect of facing Jenkins, hearing the details of his confession, was terrifying, yet necessary for their healing. The breakthrough in James Dalton's cold case instantly ignited a media frenzy. Local and national news outlets descended upon Houston, eager to report on the dramatic turn of events. Reporters clamored for interviews with detectives, family members, and anyone who had known James or Jenkins. Documentaries that had previously aired about the unsolved mystery were updated, featuring the shocking new developments. The 1996 tragedy, which had faded into the background for many, was thrust back into the public consciousness with an intensity that surprised even seasoned journalists. Analysts discussed the advancements in forensic science, the dedication of cold case units, and the enduring power of a family's unwavering pursuit of truth. The story resonated deeply, not just as a tale of crime and justice, but as a testament to perseverance, and the idea that some wrongs, no matter how old, can eventually be made right. The media coverage served as both a constant reminder of the pain and a powerful beacon of hope, bringing James Dalton's story to a whole new generation and ensuring that his memory, and his eventual justice, would not soon be forgotten. The media coverage served as both a constant reminder of the pain and a powerful beacon of hope, bringing James Dalton's story to a whole new generation and ensuring that his memory, and his eventual justice, would not soon be forgotten. The culmination of this long, arduous journey arrived in a hushed courtroom. After weeks of intense testimony, harrowing details, and compelling forensic evidence, the jury delivered its verdict. The hush that fell over the packed room was palpable as the foreman rose, and the single word, "Guilty," echoed, clear and resounding, sealing Robert Jenkins's fate. Justice, after 20 long years, had finally found its target. The prosecution had meticulously laid out their case, the irrefutable forensic links, Jenkins's own confession, which, though recanted by his defense, was powerfully corroborated, and the chilling motive born of deep-seated envy. The defense's attempts to portray Jenkins as a victim of circumstance, of faulty memory and overzealous prosecution, crumbled under the weight of objective truth. Sentencing followed, a formal and solemn proceeding that underscored the gravity of Jenkins's crime. The judge, acknowledging the premeditated nature of the murder, the suffering inflicted upon the Dalton family, and the betrayal of trust within a community, handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Robert Jenkins, the man who had stolen James Dalton's future, would spend the remainder of his own life behind bars, a testament to the enduring reach of justice. For the Dalton family, this verdict was more than just a legal outcome. It was the final, definitive answer to a question that had tormented them for 2 decades. It was the moment the earth beneath their feet, so long unsteady, finally solidified. The emotional conclusion for the Dalton family was a complex tapestry of devastation and ultimately, a profound sense of peace. Susan Dalton, her face etched with years of struggle, spoke outside the courthouse, her voice trembling but firm. She thanked the cold case unit, the prosecutors, and most importantly, James. She spoke of the man he was, the void he left, and the enduring love that had fueled her fight. Her children, standing by her side, echoed her sentiments, speaking of their father's legacy, not as a victim, but as a hero whose spirit finally found peace. They emphasized the importance of never giving up, of holding on to hope even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Their journey had been one of unimaginable grief, a relentless pursuit of truth, and a stubborn refusal to let James become just another statistic. Their perseverance became an inspiration, a beacon for other families trapped in the agonizing limbo of unsolved cases, demonstrating that the passage of time does not diminish the call for justice. James Dalton's legacy, once overshadowed by the mystery of his death, now shone brightly. He was remembered not just as a dedicated firefighter, a loving husband, and a devoted father, but as the catalyst for a triumph of justice over time. His story, once a tragedy, transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience, a testament to the meticulous work of law enforcement, and the unwavering strength of a family. The community, finally understanding the full picture, mourned James anew, but this time with the quiet dignity of closure. His impact reached beyond his immediate family and friends, inspiring a renewed commitment to cold case investigations and reminding everyone that no victim is ever truly forgotten, and no perpetrator can hide forever. And so, the story of James Dalton, the firefighter laid to rest with dignity, and the truth finally revealed, concludes. We thank you, our viewers, for joining us on this emotional and compelling journey. Your engagement, your comments, and your shared desire for justice fuel our work. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video to help us continue bringing these important stories to light. Your support helps us ensure that the echoes of the past can still be heard, and that justice, however long delayed, can ultimately be found. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember the power of truth.